The snow was coming down so hard it erased the streetlights, turning my driveway into a narrow tunnel of white. It was still dark, well before sunrise, and the wind kept slamming flakes sideways into my face as I warmed up the truck. The plow was mounted. The GPS was loaded with one route that mattered more than any other, the highway straight to the hospital. When the state called and offered me an emergency contract, double pay, hazard conditions, no delays, I said yes without asking a single question. In storms like this, minutes are the difference between help arriving and help arriving too late. I had one boot on the step when headlights flooded the snow. A tow truck rolled in and stopped sideways across my driveway, perfectly placed to trap me in. Diane Mercer stepped out, calm and composed, clipboard tucked under her arm like this was a routine inspection. She smiled politely and explained that my truck violated HOA rules. Commercial vehicle, visible from the street. She spoke evenly, almost kindly, as if she were protecting the neighborhood from chaos. I told her about the hospital route. About the emergency. She nodded and said rules only matter if they apply during emergencies. Chains clanked onto my tires as the storm howled louder. That was when I understood this was not confusion. It was control, and every second she wasted was a second someone else might not have. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I have never built my life around big contracts or impressive numbers. I built it around showing up. When winter hits our part of the state, I am the person towns and counties call when their regular crews are stretched too thin. I take the jobs that are inconvenient, the routes nobody wants because they are long, exposed, and rarely appreciated. It is not glamorous work. It is cold, exhausting, and sometimes dangerous, but reliability matters. If I say I will be there, I am there. That reputation is the only reason the state even had my number saved. Laura understands that better than anyone. She has lived through enough winters to know what these storms take out of me. That morning, she stood in the kitchen with a mug of coffee she never touched, watching snow stack up against the windows faster than she had ever seen. She did not try to talk me out of it. She never does. She just asked me to be careful and reminded me to keep my phone loud enough to hear over the engine. We both knew this storm was different. Weather alerts had been going all night. Roads were already closing. Ambulances were stuck on side streets, waiting for plows that could not get to them in time. The route the state assigned me was not just another stretch of asphalt. It was the main artery. One long highway that cut straight through the county and ended at the only regional hospital for miles. No alternate access. No back roads that could handle emergency traffic. If that road closed, everything behind it stalled. Fire trucks, ambulances, doctors trying to reach their shifts, patients who did not have the luxury of waiting for conditions to improve. That was why every minute mattered. The HOA, on the other hand, had never cared about minutes, or context, or reality beyond appearances. Diane had been strict even before she took over as board leader, but once she did, everything hardened. Lawns had to be cut to exact measurements. Trash bins could not be visible for more than a narrow window of time. Holiday decorations were fined if they stayed up a day too long. She enforced rules the way machines enforce code, without room for judgment or exception. She always explained it the same way. Calm voice, measured tone. Property values, consistency, order. She made it sound responsible, even noble. Anyone who pushed back was framed as selfish or careless, someone who did not understand how fragile communities were without firm control. Over time, most people learned it was easier to comply than to argue. I stayed out of her way by design. My truck was usually stored off-site during the winter. That morning was the exception. The storm rolled in faster than forecast, and I parked at home so I could respond immediately. One practical decision was all it took to put me directly in her crosshairs. When the tow truck started lifting the front end of my plow, the sound cut through everything else. Metal groaning under weight, chains tightening. Snow crunching beneath tires as the suspension shifted. Rick, the tow driver, would not meet my eyes. He kept glancing at Diane, waiting for her signal. He knew this was wrong. You could see it in the way his hands hesitated on the controls. Diane did not hesitate at all. I told her again where I was going. I explained the hospital route. I told her ambulances were already delayed. She listened patiently, nodded once, and said she understood. Then she said emergencies were exactly when rules mattered most, that if she allowed an exception now, the rules would stop meaning anything. She spoke like she was protecting the neighborhood from collapse, like she was the last barrier between order and chaos. The wind picked up, rattling the truck. Snow coated the chains faster than I could brush it away. I looked at my watch and felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold. Minutes were bleeding away. Somewhere, someone was waiting for help that had not arrived yet. That was when the fear settled in. Not fear of fines, not fear of confrontation, fear that the delay happening in my driveway would ripple outward into consequences I would never see but would always carry. I stopped trying to convince her. My fingers were numb as I pulled my phone out, the screen barely responding through my gloves. I stepped away from the truck, snow filling my boots, and stared at the untouched highway beyond the neighborhood. The storm did not care about HOA rules. The hospital did not care about appearances, and the longer I stood there, the more obvious it became that the system meant to keep people safe was being blocked by someone who believed control was the same thing as responsibility. That was the moment I knew this was bigger than a tow truck, bigger than fines, bigger than me, and that was the moment I decided to act. I tried reason first, because that was the only tool that made sense in that moment. I told Diane exactly what the state had asked me to do. I explained that the highway was designated for emergency access, that ambulances were already delayed, that this was not about convenience or money. I kept my voice steady, even as the wind cut through my jacket and numbed my face. I pointed toward the buried road beyond the neighborhood, like the storm itself might help make the case. She listened without interrupting. Chin lifted, shoulders squared. Clipboard tucked neatly against her coat. When I finished, she nodded once and spoke in the same calm, measured tone she always used. I understand the urgency, she said, but emergencies do not excuse violations. She explained that rules only work if they apply when things feel chaotic. That allowing my truck to leave would set a precedent, that once exceptions were made, enforcement stopped meaning anything at all. She said it like she was delivering a lesson, not blocking a hospital route in the middle of a blizzard. Rick shifted beside the tow controls. He cleared his throat and suggested maybe they should pause until things were clarified. His eyes kept drifting toward the highway, then back to Diane. You could tell he knew this was wrong, but he also knew who was giving the order. Diane did not look at him. She just said evenly, "Continue." The chains tightened again, metal biting into rubber. The sound was sharp and final. My heart started hammering, not from anger, but from the clock I could feel ticking in my head. Every second felt heavier than the last. I pulled my phone out with numb fingers and stepped away from the truck. Snow pushed into my boots as I dialed the number the state had given me less than an hour earlier. Natalie Brooks answered almost immediately. The moment I explained what was happening, her tone changed. "Stay on the line," she said. "Do not let that vehicle leave your driveway." I heard voices in the background, someone asking for names. Another voice saying, "Bring legal in." Natalie came back and told me state counsel was joining the call. Diane noticed right away. She asked who I was speaking to. I told her the truth. She sighed, the way someone does when they think they're about to correct a misunderstanding, and held out her hand. "I'll handle it," she said. Natalie stayed connected as I handed my phone over. Diane took it confidently, posture still rigid, chin still high. She introduced herself, citing HOA bylaws and commercial vehicle restrictions, explaining how consistency protected the community. Her voice was smooth, reasonable, controlled. Then she stopped mid-sentence. I watched the shift happen in real time. Her shoulders stiffened. The polite smile faded. She tried to interrupt, but whoever was on the other end did not let her. The color began draining from her cheeks, replaced by a tight, strained focus. Alan Pierce identified himself as state legal counsel for emergency operations. He spoke calmly, deliberately, the way someone does when they are stating facts that do not need debate. He explained that a state of emergency had been declared earlier that night. He explained that my truck was now classified as emergency response equipment. He explained that interfering with its deployment could be considered obstruction of emergency services. Rick heard enough to freeze. Without waiting for instruction, he stepped back from the controls and started loosening the chains. Snow slid off the tires as the tension released, thudding softly onto the pavement. Diane tried to recover. She said she was only enforcing rules, that she had a duty to maintain standards. Alan's voice did not change, but it cut through her justification like a blade. He told her standards did not outrank public safety. He told her every minute of delay was being documented. He told her that if anyone was harmed because of this interference, responsibility would be traced. The clipboard slipped slightly in her hand. When she handed the phone back to me, she did not meet my eyes. Her posture had changed completely. The lifted chin was gone. Her shoulders had dropped, like something heavy had finally settled in. She told Rick to leave. He did not hesitate. Before getting into her vehicle, she turned toward me, eyes hard, voice low. She said this was not finished, that the HOA would address my violations properly. Then she drove away. I climbed into the truck, hands shaking, heart still pounding, and pulled out into the storm. The highway ahead was untouched, buried, waiting. I was already behind schedule. As I lowered the plow and pushed forward into the whiteout, one thought stayed with me, louder than the engine and the wind combined. Minutes mattered, and someone had been perfectly willing to waste them. Once I hit the highway, everything narrowed to motion, sound, and survival. The plow blades slammed into drifts that felt more like walls than snowbanks, the impact shuddering through the frame and into my shoulders. Wind shoved sheets of snow sideways so thick they erased the road almost as soon as I cleared it. Visibility dropped to a few truck lengths at best. Every advance felt temporary, like the storm was daring me to keep going. Abandoned cars appeared without warning. A sedan half buried in a lane, doors cracked open. A pickup angled into a snowbank, hazard lights blinking weakly beneath ice. I slowed whenever I saw shapes ahead, heart hammering, afraid the next mound might be a vehicle or someone still inside. More than once I had to back up, reposition, and take another run just to keep the blade from catching on something hidden. My fingers were numb inside my gloves, wrists aching from fighting the wheel, jaw clenched so tight my teeth hurt. The radio crackled constantly. Updates, warnings, reports of stalled emergency vehicles on feeder roads. Each message carried the same urgency I felt in my chest. I kept thinking about the delay back in my driveway, about those wasted minutes. Every time the truck lurched or the wind shoved me sideways, the thought came back sharper. I should already be farther along. Then, behind me, I saw the lights. An ambulance crept forward in the cleared lane, tires following the narrow path I'd carved. Later, Captain Mark Ellison would tell me the patient inside was having a cardiac emergency, that without the road being passable, they would have lost precious time they didn't have. That the patient made it. When I heard that, hours later, I had to pull over and let the engine idle while the weight of it settled in. My hands were still shaking, not from cold, but from the realization of how close everything had come. While I was pushing through the storm, Laura was watching a different kind of damage unfold at home. She started calling me, then texting, but I never felt the phone. My focus was locked on the road. When she opened the neighborhood page, hoping things had cooled off, she found Diane posting again. Calm. Polished, carefully worded. Diane wrote that a resident had attempted to misuse emergency authority to bypass community rules. She warned that allowing unauthorized commercial activity during a crisis put neighbors at risk. She framed herself as the only person willing to stand firm when emotions were running high. The comments followed quickly. Confusion. Agreement. Praise for holding the line. A few people questioned it, but Diane responded smoothly, steering the conversation back to safety and order. She never mentioned the hospital. Never mentioned the state call. Never mentioned the tow chains. She didn't have to. She was rewriting the story in real time. By the time I finished the route and turned back toward home, the battle had shifted. The physical obstruction had failed. The truck was moving. The road was open. Someone was alive because of it. But Diane had found a new way in. She didn't need tow hooks or chains anymore. She was using reputation, fear, and the quiet pressure of public opinion. Laura met me at the door when I finally got back, exhaustion etched into her face. She showed me the posts, the comments, the careful way Diane had twisted the truth without ever outright lying. Standing there, peeling off wet gloves and boots, I felt the cold in a different way. The storm outside was dying down, but something else was building. The conflict was no longer about whether I could plow a road. It was about whether I would be painted as a problem for doing it. That was when I understood the real turning point. Diane hadn't lost. She had adapted. The fight had moved from snow and steel to words and perception. And that kind of storm lasts much longer. By the time I pulled back into the driveway, exhaustion sat in my bones heavier than the snow ever had. I shut the engine off and just sat there for a moment, listening to the metal tick as it cooled, hands resting on the wheel. My body felt wrung out. All I wanted was heat and sleep. Then I saw the papers. Bright orange notices were stuck to my garage door and the side of the house, flapping in the wind like warning flags. I peeled one off, then another, then another. Violations. Unauthorized commercial vehicle. Improper storage. Failure to comply with board directives. Each notice looked official, precise, and cold. At the bottom of the stack was a typed letter outlining fines so large my stomach tightened as I added them up in my head. The tone wasn't corrective. It was threatening. Pay promptly or face additional action. Laura saw my face before I said a word. She took the papers from my hands, read them once, then again more slowly. When she looked up, there was no panic in her expression, just focus. Document everything, she said. That night, while most of the neighborhood slept, we became archivists. We photographed the truck from every angle. The notices, the timestamps on my phone showing when the state called and when I left the driveway. Laura pulled up the neighborhood page and saved screenshots of Diane's posts, comments, and replies. We installed cameras facing the driveway and front yard, not because we wanted surveillance, but because it was clear someone was trying to build a narrative, and we needed the truth preserved exactly as it was. The next morning, I sat across from Samuel Reed in his small office, still smelling faintly of diesel and snow. He listened without interrupting while I laid it all out from the beginning. The tow attempt. The emergency call. The phone handoff. The fines. The public posts. When I finished, he leaned back, folded his hands, and let out a slow breath. This isn't enforcement, he said. It's retaliation. He explained that once the state declared an emergency, my work fell under public safety operations. Any attempt to interfere, especially after being warned by state legal counsel, crossed a serious line. He tapped the violation notices with his pen and said the pattern mattered more than any single fine. Selective enforcement. Harassment. Interference with emergency response. Words that sounded unreal, applied to my very real life. The HOA meeting later that week felt nothing like the usual routine gathering. Chairs were pulled in from storage. People stood along the walls. The room buzzed with tension before anyone spoke. Diane sat at the front table, posture perfect, a stack of papers arranged neatly in front of her like armor. When she spoke, her tone was calm, measured, and unwavering. She did not mention the blizzard or the hospital. She talked about standards, consistency, the danger of emotional decision-making. She framed the fines as unfortunate but necessary, insisting that rules could not bend simply because circumstances were uncomfortable. Claire Monroe jumped in quickly, her voice sharp and confident. She repeated the familiar line that rules were rules, that letting one person slide opened the door for everyone else. She implied I thought I was above the neighborhood simply because I had a truck and a contract. A few heads nodded. For a moment, it felt like Diane's version of events was winning. Then Ben Alvarez stood up. Ben is a volunteer firefighter. He didn't raise his voice or quote policy. He talked about response times, about what happens when roads aren't cleared, about standing beside people on the worst day of their lives and knowing help is minutes away or minutes too late. He looked around the room and asked a simple question. Who wanted to explain to a trapped family that consistency mattered more than access? The room shifted. Megan Dalton stood next. She was still wearing hospital scrubs under her coat, hair pulled back tight. She spoke quietly, but every word landed. She talked about that night, about the ambulance that arrived just in time, about a patient who went home because a road was passable. She didn't name anyone. She didn't have to. Silence settled in. When I finally spoke, I kept it simple. I explained my work, my timeline, and the call from the state. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I just told the truth, start to finish. By the time the meeting ended, the air felt different. The certainty Diane relied on had cracked. Questions hung unanswered. People looked at each other instead of the board. For the first time since the storm, I felt something close to balance return, not victory, but momentum. The room did not calm down after that. If anything, the tension sharpened, like everyone could sense something was about to break. Diane straightened the papers in front of her, pressed her palms flat on the table, and said the discussion had gone far enough. Her voice was still steady, still measured, but it carried an edge now. She said the board had no obligation to create exceptions based on emotion or circumstance. Rules existed to prevent chaos, and compromising them even once was how order collapsed. She said there would be no changes. That was when Frank Dalton pushed his chair back and stood up. Frank moved slowly, carefully, like someone who had learned patience over a long life. Most people knew him as the quiet older man who walked his dog every morning and rarely spoke at meetings. What many had forgotten was that he had been there at the beginning, when the neighborhood was first formed and the HOA documents were drafted. He didn't argue. He didn't accuse. He just spoke. Frank said the rules were never meant to punish people for stepping up when it mattered. They were written to stop neglect, not to block emergency work. He said the board was supposed to preserve the spirit of the community, not enforce compliance for its own sake. As he spoke, the room grew quieter, the kind of quiet that comes when people realize they're hearing something true. Diane tried to interrupt, citing procedure and time limits, but Frank raised a hand and reminded her that the bylaws required the board to hear motions related to safety. That single word changed the temperature in the room. Safety. Frank proposed a narrow motion, temporary exemption for vehicles actively engaged in state or county emergency response during declared emergencies. Nothing broad, nothing permanent. Just common sense written into policy. Ben Alvarez seconded it immediately. Diane's composure finally slipped. She said the motion was out of order. Then she said it hadn't been submitted in advance. Then she argued it required committee review. Each objection came faster than the last. Murmurs rippled through the room. Someone pointed out that fines had been issued overnight without advance notice. Another asked why procedure only mattered now. Samuel leaned toward me and whispered that she was stalling. Frank responded calmly, citing sections of the bylaws Diane herself loved to quote. Megan backed him up, reading directly from a printed copy. Even Claire tried to jump in, but her voice was drowned out by growing frustration. When the vote was finally called, hands went up across the room. Neighbors who had never spoken at meetings before. People who had sat on the fence for years. Even a few who had supported Diane earlier hesitated, then raised their hands anyway. The count wasn't close. For a moment, Diane just sat there, staring at the room like it had betrayed her. The authority she relied on had evaporated in public, on the record, in front of everyone she claimed to protect. She gathered her papers with sharp, hurried movements, stood up, and said the board would review its options. Then she walked out. The door closed harder than it needed to, echoing down the hallway. No one followed her. No one tried to stop her. People started talking all at once. Relief, disbelief, quiet pride. Frank sat back down, looking tired but steady. Ben clapped him on the shoulder. Megan gave me a small, knowing smile. I should have felt victorious. Instead, a knot settled in my stomach. The way Diane left told me everything I needed to know. People like her don't accept public defeat. They escalate. As the room emptied, Samuel leaned in and said quietly, "Watch what comes next." The meeting was over. The fallout was just beginning. The retaliation came quietly at first, the way it always does when someone thinks they're being clever. 2 mornings after the meeting, a patrol car rolled into my driveway just after sunrise. I knew why before the knock even landed. Laura looked at me from the kitchen, coffee halfway to her lips, and we both understood that Diane wasn't done. Officer Tyler Ross stood on the porch, polite but uneasy. He said a complaint had been filed, alleging that I was operating unlicensed commercial equipment, damaging HOA property, and intimidating board members. The words sounded rehearsed, too clean. I handed him the binder Samuel had helped me put together, state contract, timestamps, emails, the emergency declaration, photos from the tow attempt. Ross flipped through it, nodding, his jaw tightening with each page. "This isn't the first call," he said quietly, "and it's starting to look like a pattern." He documented everything, took photos, and told me to keep doing exactly what I was doing. Before he left, he glanced up at the cameras under the eaves and said, "Those are smart." That night, the house went still early. The storm had passed, but the air felt charged, like something was waiting to happen. Sometime after midnight, the cameras picked up movement in the driveway. A hooded figure stayed just outside the cleanest angle, moving fast and practiced. There was a sharp metallic sound near the front tire, then another. 4 quick motions. 4 dull thuds. The figure disappeared into the dark. I discovered it before dawn. I stepped outside, and the plow scraped uselessly as I tried to move the truck. A hollow, scraping sound that told me everything before I even looked down. All 4 tires were shredded sidewalls cut clean through. The truck sagged, helpless. For a moment, I just stood there, breath fogging, listening to the wind and that awful scrape echoing in my head. Another system was rolling in later that week. Not as bad as the last, but enough to matter. Enough that minutes would matter again. Laura came out behind me and covered her mouth with her hand. This wasn't paperwork. This wasn't a meeting. This was sabotage. Someone had made a deliberate choice to take me off the road. Officer Ross was back within the hour. He reviewed the footage frame by frame. The face stayed hidden, but the intent was unmistakable. Timing, route of approach, where the cuts were made. He didn't sugarcoat it. "This is criminal," he said, "and it lines up with the rest." Samuel moved fast. By midday, he had filed for a restraining order, laying out the pattern in plain language: attempted interference during a declared emergency, retaliatory fines, false police reports, and now property damage designed to prevent emergency work. The judge didn't hesitate. Diane was ordered to stay away from me, my property, and any indirect contact through the HOA. All communication was to go through counsel only. For a brief moment, it felt like a line had been drawn. Diane crossed it anyway. She couldn't accept being overruled in public, constrained in private, and forced into silence. So she went where she thought she could still control the narrative upward. She filed a formal complaint with the state, accusing me of falsifying hours, exaggerating conditions, and billing for routes I never completed. She framed it as civic duty, as protecting taxpayer funds from abuse. On paper, it sounded serious, dangerous. In reality, it was reckless. The state didn't argue with her. They verified. Every mile I drove was logged. Every minute time-stamped. GPS data traced my route precisely, showing when the plow was down, when it lifted, how long each pass took. Dispatch records matched radio logs. The ambulance timeline matched the cleared lien. The minutes she'd tried to steal from me were recorded down to the second the complaint collapsed under its own weight. Worse for her, it proved intent. After being warned by state legal counsel, after a restraining order, she had knowingly filed a false report to interfere with emergency operations. Investigators called me directly. They asked about the tow attempt, the fines, the meeting, the cameras. When I mentioned the tire slashing, they asked for the footage. Then they asked about her sister. Holly Mercer had been seen near the neighborhood the night my tires were cut. A contractor she used for odd jobs stopped returning calls. When questioned, he admitted he'd been paid cash to send a message. He said he didn't ask questions he didn't want answers to. He handed over the texts. What Diane thought was a final strike turned into a full investigation. By the end of the week, this wasn't an HOA dispute anymore. It was a state matter involving false reporting, obstruction of emergency services, and coordinated harassment. Patrol cars showed up at her house. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as authority finally moved in the opposite direction. Standing in my driveway beside the truck, new tires mounted, plow ready again, I felt something settle that surprised me. Not triumph, relief. Because the truth hadn't needed exaggeration. It had just needed time, evidence, and light. And once it had all three, there was nowhere left for Diane to hide. Once the state stepped in, everything that had felt slow and suffocating suddenly moved with purpose. Investigators didn't ask leading questions or entertain explanations wrapped in good intentions. They followed evidence. Phone records, timestamps, GPS logs, camera footage. They treated the situation the way it should have been treated from the beginning, not as a neighborhood disagreement, but as interference with public safety layered with retaliation. The connection between Diane and her sister came apart first. Messages pulled from their phones showed coordination going back weeks, long before the storm ever hit. They talked about enforcement strategies, about setting an example, about making sure I didn't feel comfortable operating out of the neighborhood again. After the HOA meeting didn't go their way, the tone shifted. The language hardened. Words like pressure and consequences appeared more often. There was even a message from Holly suggesting that if he can't drive, he can't work. That message mattered. When investigators confronted Holly with the timeline and the camera footage, she tried to deflect at first, saying she was only offering advice. That story collapsed quickly. Location data placed her vehicle near the neighborhood the night my tires were slashed. The contractor she regularly used for odd jobs eventually admitted he'd been paid cash to disable the truck. He said he thought it was about intimidation, not realizing he was stepping into something that had already crossed into criminal territory. With that confession, there was no ambiguity left. Charges were filed for false reporting, harassment, and coordination to interfere with emergency services. Diane's earlier complaints, once framed as responsible oversight, now read like calculated attempts to obstruct and punish. Her insistence that she was just enforcing rules didn't survive contact with the evidence. Context stripped her words of their polish and left only intent. The story didn't stay quiet for long. Local media picked it up, and for once, the framing was simple and accurate. An HOA leader tried to block a snowplow assigned to keep a hospital route open during a blizzard. Everything else, fines, bylaws, meetings, became background noise. What people focused on were ambulances, response times, and how close the situation came to turning tragic. Neighbors who had stayed silent started reaching out. Some apologized. Others admitted they had been afraid to speak up, worried they would become the next target. I understood that fear better than ever. When authority is exercised without restraint, silence feels safer than resistance. Diane resigned before the board could formally remove her. The resignation letter was brief and carefully worded, citing personal reasons and the stress of public scrutiny. It did not mention the investigation. It did not mention the storm. It didn't need to. Everyone already knew why she was stepping down. The board moved quickly to stabilize things. An interim leader was appointed and a special meeting was scheduled. The tone of that meeting couldn't have been more different from the last one. No defensiveness. No lectures. Just acknowledgement that the system had failed and needed correction. The emergency exemption Frank had proposed was formally written into policy, expanded slightly to include county and volunteer response vehicles. The language was clear and unambiguous. During declared emergencies, response work came first. Enforcement actions were suspended. No single board member could act unilaterally. Fines required multiple approvals. Communication had to be documented. These weren't dramatic changes. They were practical ones. Guardrails designed to keep power from concentrating in one place again. Slowly, the neighborhood settled back into something familiar. The cameras stayed up, but they felt less necessary. My truck stayed in the driveway when storms were forecast, and no one complained. In fact, a few neighbors thanked me the next time snow came down. One left a thermos of coffee on the porch during a later storm, a quiet gesture that meant more than any public apology. Diane moved away not long after everything wrapped up. There was no announcement, no farewell. Just a house listing that appeared one morning and disappeared a few weeks later. The chapter closed without ceremony, which felt fitting. The crisis ended the way most real ones do, not with fireworks, but with accountability, correction, and a community forced to reckon with how close it came to real harm. The road stayed open. The systems adjusted, and the neighborhood learned, the hard way, that order without judgment isn't stability at all. It's just control waiting to fail. When everything finally quieted down, there was no sense of victory waiting for me. No moment where I felt like I had won something. I went back to the same routines I had before. All of this, checking forecasts, servicing the truck, answering calls when storms rolled in. The work stayed the same, and that felt right. The road had always mattered more than the conflict. A few weeks later, an envelope arrived from the state. Plain. Official. Inside was a short commendation acknowledging emergency service during extreme conditions. Nothing dramatic. Just a recognition that the highway stayed open when it mattered. I read it twice and sat there longer than I expected. Laura framed it and hung it in the hallway next to my license and an old photo of the truck buried in snow after a long night. Not as a trophy, as a reminder that those frozen, exhausting minutes counted for something. Months passed. Life settled. Then one afternoon, I saw Diane in a grocery store in the next town over. No clipboard, no authority. She looked smaller somehow, like the certainty that once carried her had finally drained away. Our eyes met for a second. She looked past me, turned down another aisle, and disappeared between shelves. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to resolve. That quiet moment stayed with me longer than any meeting or investigation ever did. Because rules are supposed to guide judgment, not replace it. Authority is meant to protect people, not dominate them. When power loses its connection to humanity, it always collapses under its own weight. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Authority without humanity becomes dangerous. When HOA power is used to control instead of protect, the truth eventually surfaces, and real-world consequences follow.